Well, I want to thank everyone for staying tuned in because if you know me, I'm the Historic Preservation Officer for the City of St. Augustine. So my experience with sea level rise and cultural heritage vulnerabilities to sea level rise is from a little bit different perspective, but I think that it's going to be good to bring in some local government experience as far as sharing what it is that we're doing here at the city. So my position includes basically the regulatory arms of the City of St. Augustine in our small little town of 14,000 people, but we've got over 3,500 structures recorded on the site file and over 5,000 to 6,000 years of archaeological resources that we know are there. So we have a lot of things to risk that are at risk. But also I'm coming to you as a board president of the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation. So I'm very keen to hearing about the impacts of sea level rise and flooding experiences from across the state. So I really am interested in hearing about all of these perspectives. And let me change. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to start basically sharing with you some projects that we've been working on in the City of St. Augustine. And these are going to be related to flood mitigation, sea level rise, and historic preservation, just to convey how a local government can mobilize resources in an environment that is traditionally slow moving process. And I'll show you a slide later on in the end, but we have come a long way. So I am very glad that the City Commission has invested significant funds to some studies. First of all, what we had to do is just set up some policy priorities. We had to find out what it was that we wanted to focus on. We hadn't had an update historic preservation master plan since 1986. So in 2018, we had a comprehensive plan that was done by a consulting team. And one of those chapters was dedicated to hazard mitigation, and identified these policies that we needed to invest in. And significantly during that process, we were also experiencing Hurricane Matthew. So we could actually see on the front end what we needed to invest in for policy planning, building partnerships, leveraging funding. And so that's really what we're going to be talking about today with leveraging your resources, whether it's people, money, or your physical resources. So we've seen a lot of results from shoreline erosion today on protection and management planning for archaeological resources. And what this looks like above ground are potentially incompatible mitigation projects, loss of historic building materials, as well as increased impacts to the archaeological record when you see people that are elevating their structures. Our archaeology team has to go out there and investigate what's found underneath these structures, but obviously that's permanently damaging the archaeological resources. So we want to try to develop a broader plan that's going to help us go forward in a more compatible way to preserve the archaeological record to the extent that we can, that we're not going to already lose, and encourage compatible development. So the first thing that we're going to look at is funding resources. At the local level, the local government could do a special assessment in terms of just adding a tax to your property taxes and then using those funds to invest in flood mitigation projects. We also see a lot of private owners that are doing their own mitigation projects. And interestingly enough, the bottom photo here that you can see, these are 3 property owners that have banded together and decided they're going to build a property wall. They're going to do some hardening. And property walls in St. Augustine is not really uncommon because it was carried forward with Spanish colonial town planning design, where you would have a front property wall to contain your own courtyard, where you might have agriculture and you might have, horses and just things that you needed independently, but then also it helped provided a barrier. So it was a protective thing. Well, in this way, in modern times, people are also developing barriers around their entire property. and they're connecting it from the front to the sides to the back. So the unintended consequence may be we have more waters flooding our public rights of way, but we're addressing things kind of in a step-by-step, a little bit ad hoc fashion right now. One thing we also have developed is using the historic preservation property tax exemption for flood mitigation, compatible flood mitigation projects for historic properties. So what that would do is encourage a property owner, if they're doing an elevation, a building elevation project, is to do that in a compatible way so that they can keep their property taxes at a more stable rate, because obviously they're going to have increase in their property values from that rehab or a mitigation project. At the state level, I think a lot of us are pretty familiar with the grants that are available from the Florida Division of Historical Resources. The city benefited as being one of 3 pilot programs from the Florida Department of Economic Opportunity that really helped to give us some geospatial data on tipping points between the 3 different types of flooding and all types of infrastructure and cultural and historic resources in the city. So we could kind of figure out if we wanted to develop a plan, we didn't have to just pick one flood level. We could see where, the tipping points were for different resources and plan from there. Incidentally, Hurricane Matthew occurred during that time as well, and we were able to kind of do some truthing with that. And I'll get to more about the Federal Emergency Management Program that's connected to the Florida Division of Emergency Management. But I do want to make sure everyone's aware that there are resources from what's called Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. There's going to be a grant program opening September 31st, and the deadline is, I think, the end of November, so it's a short window, but there is some funding from the state that will be available from whether it's DEP or DEM to be looking into that, and I can provide a link to that in a moment. So obviously, as I said, FEMA is a federal level of resource of funding. But the counties participate by having their local mitigation strategy. And the goal with that is to get your projects on that list. So there was a project that we did called Resilient Heritage in the nation's oldest city. We had 3 concepts for flood mitigation presented in that document. And we were able to now get those on what's called the St. Johns County Local Mitigation Strategy. So that in the event that there's federal funds coming in for hazard mitigation, that those projects can be prioritized and can be funded. So if you're not familiar with what's on your local mitigation strategy, you don't have to be a part of the local government to make those recommendations, but find out who that is and get those projects on there because it is an essential way of getting funding, as well as several Army Corps projects that we have ongoing in St. Augustine. Lake Maria Sanchez Back Bay study is being done. Everyone's pretty much familiar with the seawall that was done with FEMA funding. But there are a lot of funding resources out there, and you just kind of have to figure out how to craft your project to fit into one of those categories. The other thing that we need to do is make sure that we're working with partners. And I think no one does that better than FPAN. They've been a model since I've been working with the city of St. Augustine to see how they can leverage people resources and different groups from across the country and even internationally. I think that's been really impressive. And when we were working on our Resilient Heritage project, we were able to incorporate lots of different experts as well as different funding sources. So I looked at bringing in experts from the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions because they're a nonprofit, as is the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation. So we brought in those folks in addition to our diverse, professionally diverse consulting team, which included landscape architects, resiliency professionals, engineers, and then also volunteers that would work with us when we needed to do our damage assessments, which FPAN helped us with that as well as the University of Florida Historic Preservation Program. So you want to get those resources in place so that when you have an event coming up, you know that you have some resources that you can count on in advance. And establishing your priorities really needs to come from the community at the municipal level, which is one of those things that kind of makes the wheels of progress go a little bit slower, but it's so important to getting community buy-in and community participation. So we're fortunate to have multiple workshops. It's a little bit difficult now to have the same type of workshops, but I think in the last year, we've seen a lot of ways to do it more creatively, and also do public surveys. Another way that we're learning to reach out is using story maps, teaching ourselves how to do basically integrating this data into ways that are consumable pieces of information to the general public. And I think that's a way that you can get people involved so that they're not feeling quite so overwhelmed with information, but they're also learning at the same time. So just in summary, we kind of have been taking a step-by-step process, beginning with our Historic Preservation Master Plan in 2018, which took several years, eventually getting into our Resilient Heritage publication, which occurred also at the same time as Keeping History Above Water, which we are lucky to have a workshop, a community values workshop, to get some input there. And then finally, right now, we're working on some federally funded projects that's been subgranted by the Division of Historical Resources with hazard mitigation funding from the National Park Service to actually create design, flood mitigation design best practices. So that's something that we're going to be having out really soon. And it's geared toward property owners as far as giving them case-by-case examples on different types of buildings, how they can be elevated or how they can be flood improved, whether or not it improves their flood insurance or not. We've addressed those two scenarios, and also just trying to focus on getting people information in a really handy format. We've also got a brochure that can be easily mailed to people in the event of a storm or when properties turn over. And we know that we have someone new into town that may not be from here, that wasn't here from Matthew or Irma, and they may not know what to do during either an impending hurricane or that we have nuisance flooding. So we're trying to do more to get information out to the public. And eventually, if things go our way, we will be able to integrate the guidance into our actual regulated guidelines. So I'd like to be able to do more to mandate compatible design and encourage more flood mitigation best practices. But it's really just going to be dependent upon what the community is willing to tolerate. So we'll find out in the next phase how far we can get with that. And that is the essence of what I wanted to present to you today. But I did want to give a special thanks to Sarah, because when I first came to the city in 2011, I knew nothing about sea level rise. I didn't know it was a problem. And in 2015, she was already creating educational programs. I attended one down at the GTM NER so long ago. And so it's just fun to go back and look at those photos and see how far I've been able to come with a lot of the leadership that you've been providing and getting us all together. So thank you so much. Happy to answer any questions when the time is right, but my contact information is there, as well as the link to our Resilient Heritage publication. Thank you.